Chapter 9 Banking, Inflation and Recessions by Anthony J. Evans.
It is 7 a.m. when the alarm clock sounds and your head is whizzing. You'd only returned home a few hours earlier and regret getting so drunk on a weeknight. Into the bathroom for a quick shower, realizing that you've still got that giddy buzz. You're almost dressed and you face a choice. Right now, you're headed for the mother of all hangovers, and you can already feel the headache, the nausea approaching. But on the side of the bed, there's a half-empty bottle of whiskey and you just wonder, maybe a few slugs will be enough to fend it off for a little while longer. You just need to get through the day. You slip the bottle into your pocket and head out of the door. What do 1920s Germany, Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe, America under Bush and Obama, and Britain under New Labour have in common? The answer is a catastrophic relationship between the banking system and the government, with economic policy conducted for political objectives. Financial crises are common, and there are three stages to this process of economic self-destruction: government debt, inflation, and recession. They are seen through history and across the world. You might even call them regularities. Let's look at each stage in turn.
Government debt.
We all like to spend money, and we like to spend other people's money even more than our own. Whether on wars, health systems, or public works, there is an almost infinite appetite for government expenditure. It's the reality of politics that politicians want to spend. The traditional way of financing spending is through taxation, but this is unpopular. People can get pretty angry if taxes are too high. So it saves a lot of hassle to fund spending through debt. Leave the bill to future generations and hope taxpayers are too short-sighted to care. Governments borrow money by selling bonds to investors. These work like loans, with the government promising to pay the investors' money back plus interest over a set period. This is a very powerful way to fund government activities. It was Renaissance Italy where governments first unleashed the true power of debt. Unlike other institutions, governments have the power to tax. The prospect of them not paying back a loan are therefore relatively low. But even bonds are subject to constraints. If too much money is borrowed, investors will become concerned that the government simply can't pay back the debt. This is where the third type of public finance comes in, and it is far less visible than taxation or borrowing. If private investors won't buy government bonds, central banks such as the US Federal Reserve and the Bank of England can buy them instead. In this case, one of the arm of the state has effectively financed another. Historically, this process is the cause of all major hyperinflations. Periods when prices rose very rapidly and economies collapsed, as in 1920s Germany and modern-day Zimbabwe. Most developed nations have made their central banks independent to try to stop this kind of nightmare occurring. It's important that politicians can't pay off government debts simply by ordering the central bank to create money out of thin air. The supply of money is still nationalized, however, and it is still a political issue. While the money supply may not be under the day-to-day control of politicians, central banks must still follow government policies. And it is still in the interests of governments to reduce the value of their debts by inflating the economy. This is why we live in an age of inflation, an issue we now look at in more detail.
Inflation.
How much would you be willing to pay to become a millionaire? For under £100, you could buy more than 1 million Indonesian rupiah. But that's not probably what you had in mind. The key thing to understand about currencies is that we value money for one thing: purchasing power. Being a millionaire isn't all that significant until we know how much you can buy for it. Inflation means a fall in the value of money, and as with any good, a key driver of this is the supply. For example, if there is more money, but the same amount of other goods to spend it on, then the prices of those goods will tend to rise. When the economist Milton Friedman famously said, "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon," He meant that the root cause of rising prices is a rising supply of money. In the UK, the Bank of England controls the money supply. It determines how much money gets printed and therefore how much is available for high street banks to lend out. This should strike you as highly socialist. The Bank of England is a nationalized institution with a monopoly over the supply of currency. This hasn't always been the case. Up until 1946, it was a private organization. Before 1694, it didn't even exist, but money did. Indeed, there have been episodes of free banking, most famously in Scotland in the first half of the 19th century. In these cases, private banks have been able to print their own banknotes and consumers have been free to choose between them. Of course, a free market in banking no longer exists. Banks gave up their ability to print money to the central bank, which would in turn lend to them in a crisis. The modern system of banking was born. The state promises to bail out banks that fail to protect their customers' money. Unfortunately, banks are encouraged to take risky decisions by this system. If they gamble and win, they get to keep the profits. However, if they lose, they know the central bank and the government will rescue them. The main way central banks control money is using interest rates, and there are three main rates that can influence. Imagine that you are in charge of the central bank. You can manipulate three things. Firstly, the deposit rate is how much interest is given to commercial banks for the money they keep in reserve at the central bank. Secondly, the discount rate is the rate that you as the central bank charge the commercial banks for money they wish to borrow from you. Finally, the interbank rate is the rate that commercial banks charge each other to borrow money. Since the central bank controls the money supply by altering the amount of money in circulation, you can target a particular price. This is called monetary policy, manipulating the money supply to influence interest rates. Although we commonly read that interest rates are set by central banks, they're merely the cover. It's the money supply that is the smoking gun and inflation that causes the damage.
Recession.
Most economists agree that the main consequence of inflation is a rise in the overall price level. If you see how much a basket of goods cost last year and compare it to this year, the difference is our typical measure of inflation. One of the flaws of this method is that it's an incomplete sample. It doesn't fully capture the price level for all goods. It is possible that our data tells us there is low inflation, but it is merely missing the parts of the economy where the inflation is taking place. There are many reasons why a rising price level is a bad thing. As we have already seen, inflation is a good thing for heavy borrowers because it erodes the value of their debt. But it's a bad thing for lenders because it erodes the value of their savings. So rising prices make some people better off and other people worse off. And this brings us to another consequence of inflation, one that few economists really understand. Whilst inflation leads to a rise in the overall price level, those prices don't all rise at the same time. Some prices rise more quickly than others. The main harm caused by inflation is that it distorts the whole structure of the economy, and in doing so makes painful readjustment inevitable. Prices play a crucial role in providing signals to people who are buying and selling in the market. Inflation distorts these signals and creates chaos as a result. For example, in the build-up to the 2008 financial crisis, amateur property developers would buy houses to do up and sell on. After several months of hard work and investment, they would often end up making a profit, but only because house prices had risen in the meantime. In actual fact, many of the scarce resources being spent on housing were being wasted. Whilst inflation created an illusion of success, as soon as house price inflation fell, the mistakes became obvious. Real wealth had been destroyed. Interest rates are the price that coordinates savings and investment. When market forces are allowed to work, they bring together lenders and borrowers and set a market value. This reveals how patient customers are, the extent to which they are willing to wait for goods in the future. But when the central bank creates money, this also reduces interest rates. Consumers are penalized for saving and businesses are encouraged to borrow. As a result, people save too little and consume too much. And since the real wealth of the economy, the pool of savings, has not changed, there isn't enough to go around. At some point, there'll be a scramble, a credit crunch. According to William McChesney Martin, the role of the central bank was to take away the punch bowl just when the party starts getting interesting. But in the age of inflation, they're more likely to be handing out shots. We can now return to the allegory that began this chapter. We all recognize that hair of the dog might work in the short run, but it merely delays the hangover. A hangover is an inevitable consequence of getting drunk. It's not the recovery that is the real problem here, it's the artificial boom. Policymakers are faced with this trade-off all the time, but aren't able to plan successfully for the long term. Medicine sometimes tastes bad, but it's the only lasting cure. What we see is a regular boom-bust cycle with high government borrowing leading to the creation of money to pay off the debt. In other words, government debt financed through inflation resulting in recession. For as long as politicians control the money supply, it will be ever thus.